January 12th, 1952. The Iron Triangle, Korea. 20 degrees below zero. A foot of crusty snow covering a hill that would soon be soaked in blood. Corporal Ronald stood at the bottom of that hill with 170 men from Company L, 38th Infantry Regiment. Their mission: assault a Chinese-held mountaintop and destroy the enemy's winter installations. But Ron Rosser wasn't there for the mission. He was there for revenge. 6 months earlier, his younger brother Richard had been killed by communist forces in this frozen wasteland. And Ron had made a promise that day. A promise written in anger, sealed with grief. You can't kill my brother and get away with it. What happened next would become one of the most brutal displays of individual combat in Korean War history. A story of rage, survival, and impossible odds that would earn Ron Rosser America's highest honor. This is that story. Ronald Eugene Rosser was born October 24th, 1929 in Columbus, Ohio, right as the Great Depression began tearing America apart. He was the oldest boy in a family that would eventually have 17 children. You heard that right. 17 brothers and sisters. In that house, there was no time for hobbies, no time for childhood dreams. Ron's job was simple: protect the family. If you bothered one of my brothers, I cleaned your clock, Ron would later say. And if you bothered one of my sisters, you better leave town. He was a fighter from day one. At 17, with the family struggling, Ron did what the oldest son had to do. He joined the Army in 1946, becoming a paratrooper in the legendary 82nd Airborne Division. He served in the post-World War II occupation forces in Japan and Germany, saw the ruins of a war that had just ended, learned what it meant to jump from a plane into hostile territory. But after 3 years, Ron came home, became a coal miner in southern Ohio, just like his father. The Army was behind him. He thought he was done with war. Then came June 25th, 1950. North Korea invaded South Korea. America rushed to defend its ally, and thousands of young men, including Ron's little brother Richard, answered the call. Richard Rosser never came home. When Ron Rosser got the news that his brother had been killed in action in Korea, something inside him snapped. Not grief, not sadness, rage. I had made up my mind before I went there, Ron said years later. You can't kill my brother and get away with it. Within days, Ron walked into a recruiting office and re-enlisted. Destination: Korea. Mission: make them pay. The Army sent him back into uniform, retrained him as a forward observer, the most dangerous job in the infantry. The forward observer is the eyes and ears for the artillery, positioned at the very front of the front lines. It's where you see the enemy first. It's where you die first. But Ron Rosser didn't care about dying. He cared about killing. Not many men get into the kind of combat I was in, he would later admit. Most men, their company goes up and their company comes back. I never came back. I always stayed up there, and I watched a lot of men come and go. He was going to stay on that front line until every enemy soldier paid for what they did to Richard, or until he died trying. By January 1952, the Korean War had become a frozen stalemate. The Chinese had poured hundreds of thousands of soldiers across the border the year before, pushing American and South Korean forces back down the peninsula in what became known as the longest retreat in U.S. military history. Now, both sides were dug in. Trenches, bunkers, artillery positions carved into mountainsides, and every hill became a battlefield. On January 12th, Corporal Ron Rosser and Company L of the 38th Infantry Regiment received their orders: assault a heavily fortified Chinese position near the village of Pongili. Intelligence reports said the hill was crawling with enemy troops, bunkers, machine gun nests, mortar positions. The Chinese had turned that mountain into a fortress. The Americans would attack in daylight. The temperature, 20 degrees below zero. Ron Rosser was assigned as the forward observer for the lead platoon, which meant he'd be among the first men to reach the enemy. Perfect. At dawn, the platoon began their advance. 170 American soldiers moving through knee-deep snow toward a mountain held by an enemy that outnumbered them at least 5-1. They made it halfway up the hill before the Chinese opened fire. Artillery, mortars, machine guns, rifle fire from every direction. The lead platoon was caught in a kill zone. Men dropped instantly. Blood splattered across white snow. Screams cut through the freezing air as shrapnel tore through flesh. The advance stopped dead. The Americans were pinned down at the base of the hill. Every time someone moved, they were hit. Officers yelled for cover. Medics crawled forward to reach the wounded. Soldiers pressed themselves into the snow, praying the bullets wouldn't find them. And then Ron Rosser made a decision. He turned to his radio operator, handed him the radio, grabbed his M2 carbine rifle, pulled out his one grenade, and charged straight up the hill, alone. The men around him watched in shock as this one corporal, fueled by rage and revenge, sprinted uphill through a storm of bullets toward the enemy bunkers. Ron Rosser didn't care if he lived or died. He just wanted to kill. Ron Rosser hit the first Chinese bunker at full speed. He didn't slow down, didn't take cover, didn't hesitate. He raised his carbine and opened fire. The occupants of the bunker were dead before they could react. Ron kept moving. He climbed to the top of the hill, now fully exposed to enemy fire from every direction, and spotted 2 Chinese soldiers turning toward him. Bang, bang, both dropped. Ron jumped down into an enemy trench and started moving forward, his rifle blazing. One enemy soldier appeared around a corner. Ron shot him. Another jumped out with a bayonet. Ron killed him before the blade touched him. He moved down that trench like a machine, shooting, reloading, advancing. By the time he reached the end, 5 more Chinese soldiers lay dead behind him. But Ron wasn't done. He spotted another bunker, enemy soldiers inside scrambling for their weapons. Ron pulled his only grenade, yanked the pin, and hurled it through the bunker entrance. The bunker erupted, bodies flew, smoke poured out. 2 surviving soldiers stumbled out, disoriented. Ron shot them both before they hit the ground. And then, standing on that frozen hilltop, surrounded by the bodies of the men he'd just killed, Ron Rosser looked back down the hill. He expected to see his platoon behind him. They weren't there. He was completely alone. The rest of the Americans were still pinned down at the bottom of the hill. The Chinese fire was too heavy. Every man who tried to follow Ron had been killed or wounded. Ron yelled for backup. No one came. Every time a soldier moved, he was killed or wounded, Ron would later say. It was really a nasty fight, and he was standing in the middle of the enemy position, alone, out of ammunition. The Chinese realized what was happening. This one American had slaughtered an entire section of their defenses, and now they were going to kill him. Ron saw enemy troops moving toward his position from multiple directions. He made a split-second decision. He turned and ran down the hill, straight through enemy fire, back to American lines. Bullets kicked up snow all around him. Mortar shells exploded to his left and right. He sprinted past wounded American soldiers crying for help, past bodies half buried in snow. But Ron Rosser made it back alive, and the moment he hit friendly lines, he didn't stop to catch his breath. He grabbed more ammunition, more grenades, turned around, and charged up that hill again. Ron Rosser's second assault up that frozen hill was even more brutal than the first. The Chinese knew he was coming now. They were waiting for him, but Ron didn't care. He stormed back into the trench he'd already cleared and found it full of Chinese soldiers again. They'd retaken the position. Ron raised his carbine and started firing. One soldier went down, then another, then 3 more in rapid succession. He moved through that trench a second time, stepping over the bodies from his first assault, adding fresh corpses to the pile. A Chinese soldier lunged at him with a bayonet. Ron smashed the man's face with the butt of his rifle, then shot him point blank. Another enemy soldier appeared behind him. Ron spun and fired. The bullet tore through the man's chest, and then a grenade flew through the air toward Ron. Time seemed to slow down. The grenade hit Ron in the hip and bounced off, landing at his feet. Ron couldn't run. There was no time, so he did the only thing he could. He dove over the body of a dead Chinese soldier, using the corpse as a shield. The grenade detonated. The blast was deafening. Shrapnel ripped through the air, but Ron Rosser was still alive. The dead soldier had absorbed most of the explosion. Ron felt the shockwave slam into him, felt the heat, felt something tear at his boot. When the smoke cleared, Ron looked down. The heel of his boot was completely blown off. That grenade should have taken his legs, should have killed him, but Ron Rosser wasn't dying today. He bounced back to his feet, adrenaline masking the pain, and saw a Chinese soldier poking his head up from a nearby position, checking to see if the grenade had finished the American. Ron raised his carbine and put 6 rounds into the man's belly.
The soldier crumpled. Ron kept moving. He hurled grenades into bunker after bunker, clearing positions with ruthless efficiency.
By now, the Chinese were terrified of this one maniac American who kept charging their lines, no matter how many times they tried to kill him. But then Ron's rifle clicked empty. Again, out of ammo, out of grenades. And that's when Ron saw Lieutenant Morrison, one of his officers, lying in the snow, gut shot, bleeding out. Ron didn't hesitate. He ran to the lieutenant, grabbed him, and dragged him back down the hill through the same enemy fire he'd just survived. Bullets snapped past his head. Mortar shells exploded around them. But Ron pulled that officer all the way back to American lines. He dropped the wounded man with the medics, grabbed more ammo, and turned to go back up that hill a 3rd time. The men around him stared in disbelief. Who the hell was this guy? By now, Ron Rosser had been fighting non-stop for over an hour in sub-zero temperatures. He'd been hit by shrapnel, his boot was destroyed, his body was battered and bleeding. And he was about to charge that hill a 3rd time. Ron looked at the men around him and shouted, "Follow me." He turned and sprinted uphill. A handful of brave men tried to follow him. They didn't make it. Chinese fire cut them down within seconds. Bodies dropped into the snow. And once again, Ron Rosser found himself alone on that frozen hill, surrounded by an enemy that now desperately wanted him dead. I was up on the top of this mountain by myself, taking on sometimes as much as 200 Chinese, Ron would later recall. They were all over me, jumping on my back and grabbing me by the leg. I was beating them with my rifle. This was no longer a firefight. This was hand-to-hand combat. A Chinese soldier leaped onto Ron's back, trying to drag him down. Ron spun, threw the man off, and smashed his rifle into the soldier's skull. Another enemy fighter grabbed Ron's leg. Ron kicked him in the face, then shot him. They came at him from every direction. Fists, bayonets, rifle butts. Ron Rosser fought like a man possessed, swinging his rifle like a club, firing point blank, using his fists, his elbows, anything he could to stay alive. He was covered in blood, some of it his, most of it theirs. His hands were numb from the cold and the recoil of his rifle. His ears rang from explosions and gunfire. But Ron Rosser did not stop. He grabbed his last grenades and hurled them into the remaining enemy bunkers. Boom, 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 boom. One bunker after another erupted in flames and smoke. Chinese soldiers who survived the blasts stumbled out, disoriented, and Ron cut them down. And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, silence. Ron Rosser stood on that hilltop, surrounded by the bodies of at least 13 enemy soldiers he'd personally killed, though Ron himself would later say, "I got that many in the first trench." The true number was likely closer to 40 or 50. His ammunition was gone, his grenades were gone, his rifle was barely functional, and the Chinese were regrouping for another counterattack. Ron looked down the hill at his company commander and made a hand signal. Withdraw. It was over. The withdrawal was chaos. Chinese artillery pounded the hillside. Machine gun fire raked the retreating Americans. And Ron Rosser, wounded, exhausted, barely able to stand, refused to leave until every man was accounted for. He made multiple trips across open ground under heavy fire, dragging injured soldiers back to safety. Men who were hurt far worse than he was. Men who would have died without him. By the time Company L pulled back to friendly lines, the cost was staggering. Of the 170 men who went up that hill, only 68 came back. 90 were killed. 12 more were listed as missing in action. Ron Rosser sat in the snow, staring at the hill they'd just abandoned. His brother was avenged, but the cost was almost too much to bear. A few days later, Ron's company commander pulled him aside and told him something Ron didn't expect. "You've been recommended for the Medal of Honor." Ron didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who'd watched too many good soldiers die. But on June 27th, 1952, Ron Rosser stood in the White House in full dress uniform. His entire family,
All 17 brothers and sisters, his mother and father, were there.
President Harry S. Truman placed the Medal of Honor around Ron's neck and shook his hand. It was kind of frightening, Ron would later say. All these generals were there, and congressmen and senators, everybody paying attention to you. I don't know why, but I knew my life would never be the same. He was 22 years old. Ron Rosser stayed in the Army for another 16 years. He became a paratrooper instructor, served in Germany, tried to get sent to Vietnam when his youngest brother Gary was killed there in 1966. The Army denied his request. Ron retired soon after. He couldn't save his brothers, but he'd spent his entire life trying. In the decades that followed, Ron Rosser spoke at schools, veteran events, and military ceremonies. He met thousands of people who called him a hero, but Ron never saw himself that way. I used to think about the Medal of Honor and the importance of it, he said. To me, the real honor of the Medal of Honor is that a handful of young men who were with you at a difficult time thought you were worthy of it. Over time, Ron's anger faded. He stopped thinking about the men he killed. Instead, he thought about the men he saved. Lieutenant Morrison, Private Jackson, Corporal Hayes. The soldiers he carried off that hill when his body was screaming to collapse. Those were the men Ron carried in his heart. In 1999, Ron Rosser donated his Medal of Honor to the Ohio State House, not to glorify himself, but to inspire children who visited on school field trips. He wanted them to understand sacrifice, courage, and the cost of freedom. Ron Rosser died on August 26, 2020, at the age of 90. He was buried with full military honors in Ohio, surrounded by the family he'd spent his life protecting. In the end, Ron Rosser didn't just avenge his brother Richard. He became the protector he'd always been. For his family, for his fellow soldiers, and for a country he loved enough to charge into hell 3 times, alone. This is the story of Corporal Ronald Eugene Rosser, a man who turned grief into fury, who charged a fortified hill 3 times alone, who killed at least 13 enemy soldiers and saved dozens of American lives, and who carried the weight of the Medal of Honor for 68 years, not for himself, but for the men who didn't make it home. Rest in peace, Sergeant. Your brothers are proud.